The 21st of February, my name is Cheperenko. We are presenting today the social opinion survey, Russia ahead of negotiations and their socio-political views in January, February of 2022. The research has been conducted by a number of institutions, including Business Capital, Newspaper, and Media Center Ukraine. It is very interesting to know what Russians think, because in the Ukrainian society, we are seeing the emotional seesaws that are verbalized by the American government. Every hour we see the sea change in the sentiment. It's interesting to know what's going on in Russia. Today we are hosting Mr. Denysenko, a political scientist. What's going on in Russia, sir? Welcome, everybody. Well, this is not the first research that has been conducted in the territory of the Russian Federation. Since the day one of war, we decided that we enjoy a possibility to track the sentiment in Russia, beginning with the first days of the war. As for the technologies of the research, it was conducted in the territory of the Russian Federation through the telephone opinion polls. The statistical error is about 2.85. The poll was finished 2 days ago. When we talk about how we did this, it was a classical telephone public opinion research done in every country of the world. Now let's turn to what Russians think and indeed about their attitude to the current situation. The basic question, as always, is the question is, in your opinion, do you think that the state is moving in a right or a wrong direction? Finishing as of today, what we are seeing is stable percentage. About 70% of the Russians believe that the state is going in a right direction, 13% in the wrong direction. This is one of the basic parameters in sociology. Unfortunately, we have to admit that the Russian government enjoys this high percentage over the last 3 years in spite of what's going on in the battlefield. As for the most interesting situations, something that is triggering the public opinion. You see here that ecological disaster in the Black Sea occupies 66%, the hostilities in the Kursk region 48%, and the Trump's presidency 38%. To reiterate, these data refer to the time when Russia and America agreed to start negotiations. Russians have not been that active in their response to the Trump's presidency. Not that very many of them say why they believe this is a high-stake event. What is worth for us is that they believe that the ecological disaster in Azov and Black Sea, they pay a lot of attention to that. The government was trying to muzzle the issue, pretending nothing has happened. But this situation is most trigger-happy situation for the Russians. And pay attention to the fact that the hostilities in the Kursk region, the government was trying to water that down. When I say that the Kursk region is an information silence area, I mean the following. What they call a special operation in the territory of the Kursk region, the government are trying to separate that situation there, pretending to say as if nothing special is happening in the Kursk region. They want to say a message that I would call a routinization of the situation, to make sure that the majority of the population don't pay attention to the Kursk region, as if the people there are living in another informational space. They have created an absolute island under the name of Belgorod region. This is where they have been successful in creating such a silence island. Apart from the information machinery, they failed to create such a space of silence in the Kursk region. And a lot of people believe that serious things are happening there, in spite of the fact that either the Ukrainian forces were attacking or the Russians were going into the offensive. However, the half of the population in Russia believe that this is an extra, super important issue. They refer to this as one of the key moments that are triggering their attention. Then we asked whether you are planning to spend your holidays in the Azov and Black Sea shore. You see here the data for yellow and the other data. About 40% said that they were planning. Now it has gone down to 20%. Effectively, this means that in Russia, they create another critical point under the name of the Krasnodar region. The Krasnodar region, we have to realize what is Krasnodar region. Apart from agriculture, that doesn't have anything to do with this situation. The other thing is that they are building a lot of residence areas. They are occupying third place after Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now we can say that the building in this area will go down, leading to some disbalances in the employment for a lot of people. Let us also remember that a lot of people make money on the summer season when people go for their holidays. We now know that a lot of people are not planning to go for their holidays to the Black Sea area, and perhaps it looks like they will not go there. If the information campaigns keep that track, people will not go. This is the point that is likely to be one of the tension points that currently are there and will grow in their importance. I can say now what these points are likely to be. Apart from Belgorod and Kursk, this will be Krasnodar region. And of course, this will be the Kuzbas region, where we are seeing a disastrous process dealing with the stagnation of the coal industry in the Russian Federation. What are the problems that we are mostly troubled with? The first column, what are you most concerned with currently? First place, traditionally, is occupied by the price increases up to 62%. This is the answer to the message that Russian propaganda is pushing forward, that sanctions are not effective and they are coping with the situation quite robustly. To reiterate, 62%, which is almost two-thirds of the population, believe that the prices growing up is a very problem. The continuation of the special military operation, 48%, and high interest rates, 37%. Traditionally, more than 30% are concerned with the prices for medicine and the number of the immigrants going into Russia. We are safe to say that economic situation is the main trigger for the Russian power. The increase in prices, the increase in inflation, and the price of the basic consumer prices is the headache for the Kremlin. We are sure that they don't know how to cope with this situation. The issue of migrants that they were pushing since 2023 as a problem that might push aside other issues. This issue doesn't go up to more than 30%. You will understand that the pocket and the issues with the prices are very important. As for the mobilization, what is the response? Currently, we expect that 21% believe that mobilization is a problem. In general, when we gauge the percentage of the population who believe that they will be mobilized or their loved ones will be mobilized, about 45% are concerned. Currently, there is a lot of expectation for the negotiations and the peace. That's why this number over the last 6 months is going down. Currently, every fifth of the Russians are afraid of mobilization, in spite of the fact that the Russian government de facto have prepared everything to launch mobilization. Since late March, all the bylaws will be ready, and starting 1st of April, they will be ready to launch mobilization at any given point in time, at a time when they believe it's necessary for the Russian government, or to be more precise, to President Putin. Next question is, do you believe whether the return of the Russian military will mean the increase in criminality? About 53%, more than half of the population, believe that this will lead to the exacerbation. 44% believe that this will not exacerbate the situation. This is one of the problems that will be triggering the Russian society. Going back to the question that Russians are most concerned about, I mentioned that the spike in prices, and what are the groups of consumer items. What we see is food products for 93%. What does this mean? Two-thirds of the population, more than 60%, are concerned with the price going up. Almost 100% of them are afraid that the foods will be costing more, including medicines and the spare parts for the cars, 44% here. The appliances, 34%, clothes, 33%, and children's products, 31%. And the means for washing and such things, 30% as well. What matters for us here is the following. 63% that are afraid of the prices going up are the people that constitute the poorest walks of life. Two-thirds of the Russian population are now finding themselves somewhere in the area of being poor. When we were asking, do you have enough stores and enough money for the future, 64% said that we have enough money stored for the next month, which is to say how many Russians are living in poverty. And an answer to the question that those high prices that the Russian military receive have taken them out of property. The beneficiaries of this war in the Russian Federation, we believe, are about 10 to 15 million people with a population of 150 million, which makes about 12 to 13%. The rest of the population don't feel that their stakes in terms of money have grown up. Economic crisis. The question is, do you believe that Russia is experiencing economic crisis? 18% positive and 18 almost there. In other words, 49% believe that they are in the economic crisis, rather positive than not. 18%, 46% in general. We see 50-50 calculation of the who believe that they are in economic crisis, and half of them don't think so. The next question, in your opinion, What is the basic reason for the economic crisis? The special military operation, 50% and 53% relied to corruption. The message of corruption is one of the main triggers in the Russian population. That is to say, the Russian population, which follows from one survey to another, corruption is one of the three top answers why they live in poverty. Non-competency of government, 42%. This is the first time we see so many people who don't believe in the efficiency of the government, although Prime Minister Mishustin is very popular so far. But this gauge is one of the reasons for us to understand when people are not asked a straightforward answer, they are answering in different ways. 45%, but the key issue is special military operation, including corruption. Let me also point your attention to the fact that more than 50% are talking about non-competency of the Russian government, a figure that has not been seen over the last 3 years since we have started our surveys. I don't believe this is something we saw since the time the Medvedev government resigned. The next question, which is very important for us, in your take, after the war is over, you will live better, 23%, it'll be as it is, 60%, and will be better, 9%. That is exacerbation. 2/3 of them believe that this will be no change to their material status. In other words, this is the case when we see that this correlates to the people who have not benefited from the war. I have mentioned that the beneficiaries of war are about 12 to 13% of the population. Apparently, and yes, the exacerbation is believed to be happening for them in store, 9% of the population. Perhaps the figure is much higher than 9%, but this is the situation we are seeing currently. The level of trust or distrust, the balance of distrust and non-trust to policymakers. In yellow, what we see, mistrust, and in blue, the trust the people believe in. Of course, President Putin, there is no wonder, 81% believe him. And the second place is occupied by now deceased Zhirinovsky. There are two deceased persons here, Zhirinovsky and Mr. Prigozhin. Zhirinovsky is now second place, and 76% believe in him. This is a paradox. Culturally speaking, we see the society that still enjoys the necrological beliefs. But what I'm saying is many policymakers were trying to step into his shoes, either Medvedev or Volodin, but everyone has failed to replace Zhirinovsky on this golden pedestal, in spite of the fact that it's now 2 years since he has been where he should be. Third place, Foreign Minister Mr. Lavrov. Minister Lavrov has always been among the most popular Russian policymakers. Military in general, 78%. That is to say that the trust that the military enjoys is very high. We see the decrease in popularity of the prime minister. 42% who believe that their problem is because of the non-competency of the government is very important. That is likely to be a trend for the next 6 months. Whatever the situation develops in, the situation will not be better economically, but the expectations are quite negative. The military bloggers apart from the Russian government's effort to change something in the politics of military bloggers, they are one of the most popular groups in the Russian population. The patriarch of the Russian church, then Mr. Kadyrov. Kadyrov is going down in popularity. 2 years ago, he enjoyed more than 60% of trust. The Minister for Defense, Mr. Belousov, 46 against 12, they don't believe in him, and Prigozhin has moved from 44 to 31. Sobyanin, 44 and 22. However, for us, it is important to know that Donald Trump enjoys 60%, that non-trust 13%, believe in him. The main economic enemy of the Russians is Ms. Mizulina and Mizulina, excuse me. I mentioned Prigozhin 44 against 33. The reception of the military operation. What's your take on achieving the goals of the special military operation? Fully accomplished, 39, has failed, 50%. Situation has been stable, and effectively it is identical within the statistical era. The reception of the war, do you believe whether this will be over in 25? Yes, 80% to 44% perhaps, which is to say that 52% believe that this year will see the end of the war. 8% are not ready to answer. We've got the 52 to 40% ratio. One of the painful issues for us is the issue of the Russian propaganda that has achieved a lot of success. One of the things that are most painful to us. How do you perceive the end of war? Full capitulation of Ukraine, 42%. The ceasefire, again, on the lines of today's confrontation. Then going back to the 99%, 6%, the borders of 22, also number is that high. Effectively, we have a situation when the options that are acceptable in one way or the other for Ukraine are supported by about 30% of the Russians. I think that about 10% of 13 that we have put here are acceptable for Ukraine. 60% of the Russians believe in the options that are not acceptable for us, and 40% think that this is an absolutely acceptable for Ukraine. This figure has been in decrease, and we understand that it has been going down vis-a-vis the situation in August. As for the talks per se, do you believe that Russia has to engage in peace talks? The absolute majority of Russians believe in the necessity of the peace negotiations, be it they start tomorrow or later. In principle, we saw that in August there were about 62%. Today, majority believe that peace talks have to start, which has to do with the war fatigue. This war awareness is working now and affecting the Russian population. One of the issues where Russian propaganda has failed, the way I see it, but this is important to know what the Russians think. This is one of the additional questions that we put in this questionnaire. What is more important in the military operation? Acquiring new territories or guarantees of Ukraine's not joining NATO? 30% for new territories and guarantees of Ukraine's not joining NATO, say 71%. what do we see? They are ready to go for concessions. We are talking about population, not about the Russian powers. But what matters for them is that Ukraine should not join NATO. This is one of the idea fix that they are thinking about. Another issue. Do you believe that negotiations should concentrate on Ukraine if President Zelensky stays in power? Only after the regime change, 51%, 41% doesn't really matter, 10% it doesn't really matter. We've got 51 to 41 ratio, which is to say, basically, the population don't really care whether President Zelensky is in the office or he is not. This is very important for us because many people believe that the Russian Federation has a consensus with the government on this issue. There is no consensus to that effect. It is safe to say that the Russian population feel that this is more important to start peace negotiations, 72%, vis-a-vis the point who sits on the other side of the negotiation table. When do you think Russia should start the Ukrainian talks? As soon as possible, 37%. After we have established control over Kursk regions, after the control has been taken over Kyiv, 22%, 6% other, and never 6%. Basically, what we see here, de facto, when we put together 2 points, if the Ukrainian forces were not in the Kursk region, 2/3 of the population would back up the beginning of the negotiations as soon as possible. The Kursk Oblast is a trigger for them, as we have seen. We have to be mindful of that. The next issue, the reception of Ukraine. What do you think the status of Ukraine should be after this special military operation? Neutral, a non-aligned country, 41%, a republic in the Russian Federation, 17%. Ukraine should be divided between neighboring countries, 13%, into separate oblasts of Russia, a state in the European Union, 30%, difficult to say 14%. 10% of those 14, I think, should be added to the first question, meaning that 50% of the population don't believe in the breakdown of the Ukrainian statehood, but half of them would be very happy if Ukraine were torn down, torn up. This is where we have 50-50 situation. Ukraine should stay as a separate sovereign state, 52% yes, and 42% negative, and 7% not sure. This is a clarification issue, which is very important, which is to say that more than half of the population believe that Ukraine can and should stay as an independent state. The reception of Ukraine, who are the Ukrainians? A separate nation close to Russians, 36% that this is part of the Russian people. So the message that Putin has been authoring before the war, the message about one nation, 36% believe in those super patriots. A separate nation close to Western nations, 8%, and 5% of the so-called Russian peace, Russian world idea. 40% believe that Ukrainians are a non-existent nation or part of the Russian people. Russian propaganda has not triggered a bigger and large consensus on this issue. Now we have one of the most important issues. I believe this is where we have seen quite a quantum leap vis-a-vis other periods that we have researched in. First question, do you have relatives that are participating in the military operation? 57% positive, which is to say that this is the war of the Russian people, hence the war fatigue. The wounded, 63%, prisoners of war, and the casualties. 1/3 of the Russians have either relatives or loved ones who have been wounded or killed in this war, meaning that they begin to appreciate what's going on the battlefield. This will be a triggering factor for the fatigue of war going up. Dynamics on the casualties. You see that in May, we have 19% of people saying that their relatives died. The peak was last February, was 24%. Now we see 32%. The dynamics is very crucial. On your take, how many people have died in the special military operations? More than 100,000, 32%, difficult to say. And here we have more than 50%. Half of the population seem to appreciate what's going on the front. And these are the figures that I have covered. Do you believe that the proportionality of the goals of the war and the casualties can be compared? 17% believe that they make sense, with 20% last May. Negative. The casualties are more than the achievements, 46 against 49. And now the losses are higher than the achievements, 17 to 14%. No catastrophic changes. The number that 52% believe that Russians have lost more than they have acquired. This is a new figure in our studies. The appreciation, the assessment of the military spending. Do you believe after the war, Russia should cut the military spending? Only 39% are positive, negative. Answer has been received from the 55%. What is the possibility of the fact that in 6 months' time, when the war is over, the Russian army will be cut down? How believe that this will not be cut, and the military spendings will also go down? 76% don't believe that this will happen. To rechannel the military money to the social infrastructure. We should be paying attention to these 15% who believe that the Russian government will not be cutting down neither military expenditures nor the army. This is the overview of our study. I am open to questions. Before we open the floor for questions, I would ask you the following. Following the tendencies that you have seen over the 3 years, what are the most stable sentiments of the Russian population? What are the beliefs that are stable, and what's going on in their social political senses and sentiments that we can track down? There are 3 top things here where Russians are stable. There's one extra important issue that is under the name of Vladimir Putin. Unfortunately, we have to accept that the alpha and the omega of the Russian Federation is the figure of Russian president. What is changing? The weirdness of war is something we see, and we see something as an avalanche that since mid-2024, to be more precise, since August, when there was a sharp understanding and appreciation of what war really is, what are the real losses, and in spite of the fact that sociology may say that resources of Russia are limitless, but what we see, people are for the negotiations. It seems that they are hesitant about their ability to wage this war until the very end. The floor is open for questions. Liana Polyakovska, following on the last point, what is the most important takeaway for the Ukrainians? And again, can you clarify about this survey? One of the questions is formulated in the wording like on Ukraine, whereas in Ukrainian we say in Ukraine. You see, we were asking the Russians, and they live in the Russian Federation, and we asked them in a language that they are using in those territories. I mentioned that the survey was conducted in the Russian territory with thousands of respondents through the telephone with the statistical error of 0.95. And how do you ask people over the phone? You ask, you dial the number and you say, we are not beginning questions. Hello, we are from Ukraine. We use different hello formula. When you are asking the most important issue, what do you mean? Informational war? Negotiations? I was meaning the negotiations and perhaps the change of attitude toward the peace talks. And do you think we can expect that at some point Russians will revolt? No, forget that. No skirmishes, no revolts are likely to happen. We have to talk about the following. Most important issues are related to the economy. In spite of the fact that the Russian government has invested so much of effort to put up the message that the war can be waged for a limitless period of time. A number of influential Russian economists living abroad have created a number of narratives, including very serious research saying that Russian economy will last forever. But I will reiterate, the beneficiaries of war are at the level of 11 to 12, 13%. Majority of people are in poverty situation, and that situation is exacerbating in spite of the figure that 2/3 of the population are afraid of price spiking, and they are afraid that the foods will grow in cost. It tells us that the situation at the balance point, if that number goes to 70, 71%, this will mean a critical point for the power that be. The second point that we don't read in the data, but I think that last year saw some infrastructural problems. The years 2025, 2026 are likely to be years of major or lesser infrastructural disasters that will be hitting Russia. At the beginning of the year, the key disaster is the story in the Azov Sea and the oil tankers. I mentioned that this is a problem for the whole region, including Krasnodar region, the Crimea, and the Black Sea shore. They don't receive enough money. They are under-financed. They will not be critical for the budget. That money will be critical for the lifestyle of many and many thousands, millions of people. What we are seeing in the coal industry, they are entering the phase of deep stagnation. Money is being poured into the coal industry, but apart from the infrastructural challenges that are likely to surface and then channel into major disasters, this is also a year of the bankruptcy, or the beginning of the bankruptcy, or the creeping bankruptcies of a lot of enterprises that are systemic for some regions. Let us remember that the 50% of the Russian GDP until 2022 focused in the 400 major cities, which is to say 50% in 400 citizens, and the rest of them are living on the half of the budget. 400, what they say, city-forming settlements. Bankruptcies will begin when we see now that the Ministry of Finances has see a lot of people coming from asking for donations of 1 billion rubles for us to keep the situation afloat, not to see the social revolts in the areas where we are working. This is something that the sociology cannot provide a graphic example, something we can feel and touch, but this is what will impact the Putin's way of negotiation process that effectively started last week. Do we have more questions? Thank you for your presentation. Can you tell us the impact of the Russian opposition? What's your take on that, people who are living abroad and the Russian elite within the country? Let us find the semantic meaning of what you mean by Russian opposition living abroad. Now, as for the first question, it is safe to say that since mid-2024, the rhetoric of the Russian opposition has drastically changed. What we are seeing is a research how the rhetoric of the Russian Federation, of the Russian opposition, has changed. I think we will present that research very soon. But what we are seeing very clearly, we have seen drastic changes. These changes have to do with a lot of issues. I will single out one point, which I believe is most super important. Two of them. One, lion's share of opposition have understood that they will not go into Kremlin on the backs of the Ukrainian military. Their rhetoric has changed. Second point, judging from what I see, the Russian government have decided to speed up the process of the changes in the minds of the Russian opposition. That's why they have opened up what we have seen, a pre-prepared products. Look at what has happened to Yulia Latynina now, a person who has ceased to hide her political position. What does it have to do with? It doesn't have to do with the negotiations. I think it has to do with the following. Since the end of the presidential campaign last year, the Russian power have realized that they have underestimated a hidden potential of the anti-government sentiment of the population. What is the anti-government sentiment? 20 to 24% of the Russians are backers of the ideas that are not correlated to what is known either government or the so-called structural opposition, communists and so on. The situation with the presidential candidate Nadezhdin has shown. What did the good Russians do? I don't like that term, but what did the good Russians do since the beginning of the full-scale invasion? They provided a food for thought for those 24%. And basically, they were cementing that narrative that Putinism is not forever, there is nothing wrong with it. We will live it over. We will live it through. We are now in the opposition. We are being repressed, but don't change the sides. Don't join the party of evil. Since mid-2024, the government have understood that without the so-called good Russian, they will not change the situation. They will not introduce this schism into the Russian opposition. The Russian opposition as a single whole has never existed. What they wanted to do is to split those 24% to make sure that they have 10 to 15% of those who are not sure. They were not to be convinced that they are against Putin. They had to believe that they are not joining the opposition. Russian government are now putting one of the basic narratives to the effect that Putin is forever. This is one of the most important narratives that current Russian government is pushing, and this is where they demoralize and split the 24% that I have mentioned. As for the Security Council, we don't see any sea change there. What we are seeing are attempts by Putin, who continues to pit against different persons, different groups. He has brought about a dramatic change when he has removed the former head of the Security Council. That also relates to the heads of the other governmental bodies. But to talk about some changes and what we call the revolt in power, no, we are not to expect that. We see this bottle effect, something that could have broken out, has been totally sealed. Perhaps since 2018 to 19, I can't put a name forward of any person apart from Mr. Oreshkin, who seems to be the Putin's aide on economy. There is not a single person we can identify. These people are not likely to appear. Next question, please. What is your take on the 40%, the hawkish Russian population? Will they be frustrated in case the Russian power are saying that what we are seeing today is already a victory by Russia? Do you think these people will be persuaded that what we see now is the victory already? I think that these 40% are not homogeneous. They are not like each other. The hawkish are made up by 15% of the Russian Federation. Another 25% are these ripple effects caused by the hawkish. They are underhawks rather than super hawks. When we think who might trigger some very outspoken messages, I think it's the military bloggers, very likely. But over the last year, after the death of Prigozhin and the imprisonment of Girkin, the military bloggers, their possibilities, capabilities have been decreased. Part of them have been bought up by power that be, and currently there are no financial sources to finance an informational war against this war. To reiterate, the population per se, up to 15%, will be unhappy with any negotiations because they are rooting for the full Ukrainian capitulation. Do we have more questions? They're at the back of the audience. The coal issues, will are they associated with particular names and surnames? I think that the power will do everything not to put a face on those issues. But when we think about the analogies with the Kursk and Belgorod regions, I think they will make a point of creating a silence island. These territories are now flooded with money. Will you remember the 50-year-old story in Ukraine? The money that was flooded into the Donbas region to make sure that a next march on Kyiv doesn't happen. This is what will happen in Kemerovo region in Russia. Informationally, of course, they will be kept within this silence island. Do you have more questions, please? Now, to wrap up, my question. The future talks and the rumors about those negotiations, what we are seeing is not only us, the Russian government also are keeping track of that. Hello to the secret police of Russia. The issue of Ukraine joining NATO, the issue of economic situation within Russia, how will they be used by the Russian authorities as a point in negotiations? We should be aware that they look at the polling numbers in terms of the threats to them. They don't see any real threats now. The NATO issue, I believe, has been completely closed and shut. The topic is not being discussed by the Americans, neither by the French or the Italian or the Germans. This is the issue that currently perhaps exists in Ukraine rather than elsewhere. Thank you, sir. We've been talking about the social and economic sentiments of the Russian Federation since the beginning of this year. We will resume our operation at 1300. We'll be talking about safety measures in the winter time. Thank you very much and stay tuned.